My apologies, everyone, being marred with technical difficulties, but hopefully they won't occur anymore. There will be a lot of anger in the performance of the piece, though, which I think will be beneficial to its volume. As I was saying, there's a lot of influence from Crespo's native land of Uruguay. A lot of the dances you can hear, especially the candombe. And there's a lot of referential material to other major works for the trombone, like the Bluebells of Scotland, Mahler's Third Symphony, the solo. And you'll see some really interesting notation later on. That's a lot of fun. So, right at the beginning, this was the excerpt I performed for most everyone in the class about a month ago or so. And as I mentioned there, the piece is very heavily based, at least this part of the piece, around this motive here, the low one, and then this motive here based on the triplet motive based on fourth and fifth kind of harmonies. And it reminds me very heavily of this kind of sound. The Third Symphony from Mahler, he had a great trombone solo in there, and that might be an esoteric kind of reference to it. But in the recording that Joseph Alessi made of this piece, Joseph Alessi, principal trombonist of the New York Philharmonic, very, very good trombone player, he decided that this motive should sound like this. Which, I mean, fair enough. It's something that you could do, but it's not really what Crespo wrote. Another thing that I think Alessi might have done on the piece, I think he may have practiced it a bit too much. The recording is a bit too perfect, whereas it needs to be a very kind of off-the-cuff, improvisatory, by the name, improvisation number one, and it didn't sound, its improvisatory spirit, I felt, maybe was a bit lost. But as I mentioned with this part in particular, you can choose to do it several ways. You know, with this... you can choose to take your time there, but you'll probably have to take a breath after that G, whereas Crespo kind of wants you to do the whole thing in one breath. So you kind of have to move through this piece, and it's important generally to move through the piece with an air of confidence about you. Like you're not wandering through, hacking through a jungle. It's more like you're on a beaten path through the jungle. So you know exactly where you're going. You know exactly what you're doing. So we get out of that part and we lead on the motive again. These kind of build themselves more up. They work through the different keys until there's this huge, the climax of the first page, the big fall off from the C at a fortissimo, and then you go down to an F sharp all the way at the bottom there. And it's kind of a foreshadowing of what happens later on, this huge part where it builds up so big and then it just dies away. And you kind of have to do that twice here, once with there and once there. So like loud to soft, and you have to rebuild. And these motives here are so, I'm not sure if you can see them, but they're so distinctly Latin American. The kind of, or the, later on, this one even. Very bullfightery, you know, not that bullfighting is ethical in any way, but that's the kind of attitude you have to have when you play this piece. You have to have the confidence of a bullfighter. And so the last motive there leads us into the first dance-like section, and it's in 7/8, and so it has a bit of a stumbly kind of feel, but that I think is purposeful, because we'll talk about the candombe, the dance that it's based on, a bit later on. But this part is so much fun with how syncopated. You can really get a nice groove going with. And those turns right there, they're notated, you know, in an annotation, but they're basically just kind of, I like to think of them as Carl Fontana style turns. Carl Fontana was a really famous jazz trombonist who was famous for doing really smooth kind of lines like that in his solos. And so this is a brief foreshadowing of the dance that will come later, and we'll talk later about that more. So then we're led out of that with these harmonies, and as I said, the huge climax of at least this bit of the piece where you have the first triple forte and then you're down to the F sharp, and then a whole quarter rest with a fermata on it before you come in again. And you work your way again through the glissing, and then and then this right here, I really hope this is visible, because the television has proved not to be very visible in the past. But this notation right here is basically means, what Crespo means by that is you want to move the slide back and forth between first and seventh position as quickly as you can without thinking of pitch. So that sounds, I won't spoil it now, but it's a very interesting sound, and you'll know when it comes. But that notation I've never seen before or since, so that's quite a lot of fun. Now Crespo transitions into the more traditional side of trombone literature, where it's more tonal and it's more based around what the trombone is most familiar with, like the Arthur Pryor kind of solos, Bluebells of Scotland being one of them, Fantastic Polka being another, and they're based on a lot of scale patterns, and you'll see that later on even more. But we kind of get a foreshadowing that where it's still kind of trying to work back into the triplets, but the triplets are slowly going away. Until we get to Parlando, which is one of the most interesting sections of the piece, because it's so lazy, because everything else is so sharply etched with this piece, to give a nod to Alan Atlas, the great Renaissance scholar. Everything is very sharply etched in this piece, and it's the Parlando, though, is a part where you can really be as loosey-goosey as you want to be. It's supposed to sound almost drunken, and that's the kind of effect you want to go for. And it's a great time to just let completely loose and remind yourself why you play the trombone in the first place, because it's just so much darn fun. So the Parlando is a lot of fun, and it's a very defining characteristic of this piece, and I like how it doesn't take itself too seriously. Now we get into the smaller cells with these scales, the very Arthur Pryor, as I mentioned, like scales. Like, this is the most probably tonal thing we've heard so far. All very tonal stuff. And then we kind of get a bit more of the triplet quartile and quintile harmonies, but it's more in it's in 16th notes this time instead of in triplets. Except we do get a bit of triplets. He can't help himself. Agitato, the trill with a nice little duet at the end. That's a lot of fun. And then we get into the Bluebells of Scotland, I think, because this piece, the Bluebells of Scotland, was written by Arthur Pryor in the late 1800s, and Arthur Pryor was like a showman of the trombone, and he loved to write, Bluebells of Scotland is just... It's just that melody, but Arthur Pryor embellished the crap out of it and just made it into this crazy trombone solo that ends with, crazy stuff. And so that's kind of what Crespo, I feel like, is imitating here. So you have to start out as slow as possible, and then where it says bereits doppelzunge, it means begin double tonguing. But you can't start double tonguing, it really leaves you nowhere to go. So you have to start double tonguing really, really slowly. So and then just work your way slowly through the speeds until it finally gets to the climactic, very, very fast part at the end. Then there's a short transition, mixing the 16th notes of the last section with the harmonies of the first section, working our way back through until we get one final of these big motives until the deconstruction at the end, and it leads us back into this dance party. And this one is a much slower burn than the original dance section, because it gets a whole heck of a lot more time, a whole heck of a lot more motivic development. And I love this part right here because it switches from 7/8 to common time, and it gives that extra 8th note. And it's almost like this is a leap rest, where it's like making up for the extra 8th note that's accumulated through the rhythmic values so far. So you have to really make a big deal of like do ba ba da 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 da, as opposed to the rest of it, which is like ba 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 ba, but very syncopated on that. But it's like ba 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 da 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 da, which is, it's wonderful. It comes out of nowhere, and it's such a great effect. And as you'll see in the Konami video we watch, there's a lot of exclaiming and a lot of kind of whooping going on. And if you'll notice this part right here, I feel like you could easily say that's a whoop, imitating the candombe whoopers. So yes, the candombe was a natively African dance that was brought to Uruguay through the slave trade. And when the slaves were freed in Uruguay near the end of the 19th century, the composers who were formerly slaves, they chose to focus more on European dance styles and forms of music, like the mazurka, whereas the candombe it really interested the white population of Uruguay, so they picked it up. So it turned into this big carnival, and where blackface is involved, and whereas blackface in the United States is, you know, the minstrel history of the blackface in the United States is a horrible, horrible racist past that glorifies white oppression of slaves, and Song of the South, all that kind of stuff. But this carnival, it makes a mockery of the whole slave system, and it doesn't seek to perpetuate it, whereas the American minstrelsy attempted to do that. And so there are three types of candombe: original, Uruguayan, and Argentinian. This one is obviously Uruguayan. The elements are wild rhythms, freely improvised steps, semi-athletic movements, and I feel like this is a pretty semi-athletic movement, what he calls for later on. The clave rhythm in 3/2 form, feel like, dump, bump, 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 bump. You kind of get that sense in the dance sections. And then 3 drums, low, middle, and high, and you certainly get low, middle, and high register in this piece. And so I'll show you a public performance of a lot of improvised steps, people kind of doing their own thing, hanging out, then they kind of all work together, and they all lock into this big group dance. Yeah. So that's fun. And then there's also a piece by Enrique Crespo called The Three Milongas for tuba quartet, but it's played often on trombones. And one of the movements is called candombe, and there's a section, and it's kind of fugal-like, and it sounds like this. And that certainly elicits a sense of athletic movements and the kind of improvised steps and that kind of thing. And I feel like it feels a lot like the music in the dance section. So then we get the final part where we deconstruct the original motive, and everything is just torn apart. And then finally, elongations of triplets until we get a lovely, huge leap of 2 octaves and a minor 7th to round everything out. And so that's pretty much all there really is to say about the piece. You just have to play it with a lot of confidence. And so that's what I hope to demonstrate for you right now in my playing of it. So here we go, without further